curse that refused to end. We're not talking about a spell in a castle. We're talking about something far more powerful. An idea, a fear, a story that refuses to die. At the heart of Dracula's legend is one terrifying concept: eternal life at a terrible cost. In Dracula by Bram Stoker, Count Dracula doesn't just drink blood, he steals time. He survives centuries while everyone else ages, weakens, and disappears. Immortality sounds like a gift, but in Dracula's world, it's a prison. He cannot walk in sunlight. He cannot age. He cannot truly love. He must feed to survive. That's the curse. Not death, but endless existence. Then that idea still fascinates people today. The character was partly inspired by Vlad the Impaler, a 15th century ruler known for brutal punishments. His nickname, Dracula, came from his father's title, meaning son of the dragon. But here's the twist. The real Vlad wasn't a vampire, yet his cruelty became legend, and legend became myth, and myth became something eternal. Even places like Bran Castle are now forever linked to Dracula, whether historically accurate or not. That's how powerful the curse is. It rewrites reality. Dracula didn't stay in a book. He escaped. In 1922, Nosferatu brought a shadowy version of the vampire to cinema. In 1931, Bela Lugosi turned him into an icon in Dracula. Since then, every generation has created its own Dracula. Terrifying, romantic, seductive, monstrous. He changes form, but he never disappears. That's the real curse. No matter how society evolves, Dracula adapts. War, he survives. Technology, he evolves. Modern audiences, he reinvents himself. Few fictional characters have endured like this. Dracula represents something deeper than blood. He represents fear of death, fear of losing control, fear of desire, fear of the unknown outsider. In Victorian England, he symbolized foreign invasion and hidden disease. Today, he represents obsession with youth and power. The curse isn't about a vampire. It's about humanity's darkest anxieties. As long as humans fear death, as long as we crave eternal life, as long as darkness exists, Dracula will return. In 1897, the world was changing. Electric lights were beginning to replace gas lamps. Trains were shrinking distances. Science was challenging superstition. Humanity believed it was stepping into a brighter future. And then, a shadow appeared. That shadow came in the form of a novel titled Dracula, written by a quiet Irish theater manager named Bram Stoker. At first glance, it looked like just another Gothic horror story, but it wasn't. It felt real. Unlike traditional novels, Dracula wasn't told in a simple narrative. It was built from. It read like documentation, like someone had gathered proof of something terrible. Readers in 1897 didn't feel like they were reading fiction. They felt like they were uncovering a secret, and that made it dangerous. The nightmare begins with a young English solicitor, Jonathan Harker, traveling to Transylvania to meet a mysterious nobleman. The further Harker travels east, the stranger things become. Locals whisper warnings. They clutch crucifixes. They beg him not to go, but he goes anyway, because modern men believe in logic, not superstition. When Harker finally reaches the castle, he meets his host, a tall, pale aristocrat, polite, calm, cold, Count Dracula, and slowly the truth unfolds. Their are no servants, no mirrors, no reflections. The Count crawls down castle walls like a lizard, and Harker realizes something horrifying. He is not a guest. He is a prisoner. The late Victorian era was full of anxiety. Britain feared foreign invasion. They feared disease spreading through crowded cities. They feared moral corruption. Dracula symbolized all of it. He was foreign. He brought blood contamination. He invaded homes at night. He didn't attack with armies. He attacked from inside. That's what made the nightmare so powerful. It wasn't about monsters in caves. It was about evil entering your bedroom, quietly. Vampires existed in folklore long before 1897, but Stoker transformed the creature. Dracula wasn't just a mindless beast. He was intelligent, educated, strategic. He studied London before traveling there. He learned its laws, its systems, its weaknesses. He adapted, and that made him terrifyingly modern. When Dracula was first published, it didn't instantly explode in popularity, but it lingered. It stayed in readers' minds because the ending wasn't comforting. Yes, the heroes defeat Dracula, but the story feels unfinished, like something ancient can never truly be destroyed. And that lingering feeling, that's when the nightmare truly began. Because from that moment in 1897, Dracula stopped being just a character. He became an idea that would spread across continents, across generations, across centuries. And once an idea like that enters the world, it never really leaves. Before the world feared Dracula, there was a quiet man standing in the shadows of a theater. His name was Bram Stoker. He wasn't a famous novelist when he created Dracula. He wasn't known as a master of horror. In fact, most people saw him as a polite, hard-working manager at London's Lyceum Theatre. He handled schedules, actors, and business matters. He lived an ordinary life. But inside him, something darker was growing. As a child in Ireland, Stoker was often bedridden due to illness. For years, he couldn't run or play like other children. He lay still, listening to stories told by his mother. Stories filled with disease, death, spirits, and strange folklore. Ireland in the 1800s was a land where superstition and tragedy mixed together. Those early tales sank deep into his imagination. When he finally grew stronger, he became fascinated by the power of storytelling. At the Lyceum Theatre, he worked closely with actors, watching how fear and emotion moved through a crowd. He studied human reactions. He saw how silence could be more powerful than noise, how anticipation could terrify more than violence. And somewhere in that dimly lit theater, the idea of Dracula began to take shape. Stoker spent nearly 7 years researching his novel. He filled notebooks with references to Eastern European legends, vampire folklore, and historical accounts. During that research, he stumbled upon the name of a 15th century ruler, Vlad the Impaler. Vlad was known for brutal punishments. His enemies were impaled on wooden stakes and left as warnings. His nickname, derived from his father's title in the Order of the Dragon, connected him to the word Dracul. In some translations, it meant dragon. In others, devil. That name struck Stoker. Dracula. It sounded ancient, powerful, dangerous. What's chilling is that early drafts of the novel didn't use that name. Stoker originally planned to call the Count something else. But after discovering Dracula in a history book at a London library, he crossed out the old name and replaced it. One decision, one word change, and horror history was rewritten. Yet here's what makes it more mysterious. There is no evidence Stoker deeply studied Vlad's life. He borrowed the name, but the vampire legend he created went far beyond history. It became something symbolic, something larger than any real ruler. Stoker poured his fears into the character. Fear of disease spreading unseen. Fear of outsiders entering England. Fear of moral corruption hiding behind charm and sophistication. Victorian society was anxious about change, about science replacing religion, about immigration, and shifting power. Dracula embodied all of it. He was foreign, aristocratic, educated, but beneath the elegance, he was predatory. And perhaps the most unsettling detail of all, Bram Stoker never lived to see how massive his creation would become. When he died in 1912, he was not wealthy or world famous. Dracula had gained attention, but it hadn't yet turned into the global legend we know today. It was almost as if the monster waited for cinema, waited for mass media, waited for the modern world. The man behind the monster was quiet, disciplined, and reserved. But the creature he unleashed was immortal. And once Dracula stepped out of Stoker's imagination, he no longer belonged to his creator. He belonged to the darkness.
High in the heart of Transylvania, surrounded by the cold winds of the Carpathian Mountains, stands a fortress that looks like it was built from a nightmare. Narrow towers, sharp rooftops, stone walls rising from the cliffs like claws gripping the sky. This is Bran Castle, and for decades the world has called it Dracula's Castle. But here's where the legend becomes more unsettling than the truth. There is no solid proof that Vlad the Impaler actually lived there. Some historians believe he may have passed through the region. Others argue he was briefly imprisoned nearby, but there's no strong evidence that Bran Castle was ever truly his home. Yet when you look at it, it feels like it should be. Perched above a narrow pass, the castle was built in the 14th century as a fortress to defend against invaders. It was meant to intimidate, to dominate the landscape, to remind travelers that someone powerful was always watching. And that's what makes it perfect for Dracula. Because horror doesn't need facts, it needs atmosphere. The castle's corridors are tight and twisting. Its staircases are steep and uneven. Windows are narrow slits that barely let in light. At night, fog wraps around its towers like a living thing. Imagine arriving there after days of travel. The forest silent, wolves howling somewhere beyond the trees. The heavy wooden doors opening slowly, and a tall figure waiting inside. Whether or not Vlad ruled from these walls doesn't matter anymore. The connection has fused itself into cultural memory. Tourists walk through its halls whispering about vampires. Guides tell stories of blood and darkness. Cameras flash where torches once burned. The castle has become part of the curse. Because once a place is linked to fear, it changes forever. Even if Bram Stoker never visited Transylvania, even if he never saw Bran Castle with his own eyes, the image matches the nightmare he described in Dracula so perfectly that reality and fiction blur together. That's the power of legend. Stone becomes story. History becomes myth. And myth becomes immortal. The real castle in the mountains doesn't need a vampire living inside it. Its silhouette against the moon is enough. Because sometimes the scariest part isn't knowing a monster was there. It's not knowing whether it still is.
When Dracula was published in 1897, it wasn't children hiding under blankets. It was adults. Because this story wasn't about a monster jumping out of closets. It was about something far more disturbing. Something entering your home, politely. Created by Bram Stoker, Dracula wasn't a mindless creature. He was intelligent, educated, aristocratic. He spoke calmly. He dressed well. He understood law, property, and business. He didn't smash doors down. He bought houses in London. He studied maps. He planned. And that terrified Victorian society. The fear of invasion. In the late 1800s, Britain was powerful, but anxious. The empire was expanding, yet many feared it could also crumble. Immigration into London was increasing. Foreign cultures were becoming more visible. Newspapers often stirred paranoia about outsiders. Dracula represented that fear perfectly. He was foreign. He came from Eastern Europe. He arrived quietly by ship, not as an army, but as one man. He didn't attack England from the outside. He infected it from within. To Victorian readers, this felt disturbingly possible. The fear of disease. This was also the era of deadly epidemics. Tuberculosis, syphilis, and cholera haunted cities. Medical science was improving, but understanding of germs was still developing. Dracula spreads his curse through blood. One bite, one exchange, and the victim begins to weaken. Pale skin, fatigue, slow decline. To readers in 1897, that didn't feel supernatural. It felt like disease, an invisible contamination, and that idea was deeply frightening. The fear of forbidden desire. Dracula also terrified adults because of what he symbolized sexually. In Victorian society, sexuality was supposed to be restrained, private, controlled. But Dracula's victims, especially Lucy, transform after being bitten. They become bold, sensual, hungry. The vampire didn't just drain blood, he awakened suppressed desires. To a society obsessed with moral purity, that was scandalous. Dracula threatened not just lives, but values. The fear of losing control. Perhaps the deepest fear in the novel is the fear of losing control. Dracula can hypnotize, he can remand wolves, he can turn victims into creatures who obey him. Adults reading the novel saw something horrifying in that. The fear of losing autonomy, the fear of being manipulated, the fear that evil doesn't always look evil. It can look charming, refined, persuasive. That's what separates Dracula from fairy tale monsters. He doesn't growl in the dark, he smiles in the light. Why it hit adults harder than children? Children fear what they can see, adults fear what they understand. And adults in 1897 understood the symbolism. They recognized the anxieties hiding beneath the story. Foreign influence, urban decay, hidden illness, changing social norms. Dracula wasn't just fiction, he was a reflection. That's why the book unsettled grown readers so deeply, because when they closed it at night, the real fear wasn't of fangs, it was of the world changing around them, and the possibility that the danger was already inside. When Dracula was first published, it planted a seed, but it was cinema that turned that seed into something eternal. Because books live on shelves, movies live in memory. And once Hollywood discovered Dracula, the curse stopped belonging to the page. It began living on the screen. In 1922, a German silent film called Nosferatu appeared. The filmmakers didn't secure the rights to Stoker's novel, so they changed names. Dracula became Count Orlok, but everyone knew. The long fingers, the bald head, the unnatural shadow creeping up the staircase. It was Dracula in disguise. Stoker's widow sued. A court ordered all copies destroyed. Yet somehow, some prints survived. Like the vampire himself, the film refused to die. And that was the first sign that Dracula had become something unstoppable. Then came 1931. Universal Pictures released Dracula, starring Bela Lugosi, and everything changed. Lugosi's performance wasn't wild or monstrous. It was controlled, elegant, hypnotic. His slow voice, his piercing stare, his cape sweeping across the floor. "I never drink wine." That line alone became legendary. From that moment on, when people imagined Dracula, they saw Bela Lugosi. Hollywood had given the monster a face, and faces are powerful. They make nightmares recognizable, repeatable, marketable. The decades passed, but Dracula didn't fade. In the 1950s and 60s, Christopher Lee redefined him through Hammer films, more violent, more intense, with blood that looked shockingly real for the time. In 1992, Gary Oldman portrayed a tragic, romantic version in Bram Stoker's Dracula. Now Dracula wasn't just a villain, he was heartbroken, cursed, humanized. Each era reshaped him to reflect its fears and fantasies. Sometimes he was pure evil, sometimes seductive, sometimes misunderstood, but he was always present. Cinema did something the novel alone could not. It globalized Dracula. People who never read the book still recognize the cape, the fangs, the accent. He became part of pop culture. Cartoons referenced him, Halloween costumes copied him, advertisements parodied him, and with every appearance, serious or silly, his presence deepened. Hollywood didn't just adapt Dracula, it kept feeding him. New generations met him on screen instead of on paper, and every time the character risked fading into obscurity, another film brought him back. That's the true immortality. Not eternal life inside a coffin, but eternal relevance inside culture. Dracula survived silent film, black and white, Technicolor, modern CGI, streaming platforms, because Hollywood understood something powerful. A great monster doesn't die, he evolves. And once the camera loved Dracula, the curse truly refused to end.
Dracula has survived for more than a century, not because of fangs, but because of what he represents inside the human mind. At first glance, he's just a vampire, a creature of the night who drinks blood and sleeps in a coffin. But beneath that surface, something much deeper is happening, something psychological. When Bram Stoker wrote Dracula, he didn't just create a monster, he created a mirror. And what people saw in that mirror frightened them. Dracula embodies the fear of death, but not in the simple way we expect. Most horror stories are about dying. Dracula is about not dying, about living forever. And that's where it becomes disturbing. Humans fear death, yet they are also obsessed with escaping it. Immortality is one of our oldest fantasies. Eternal youth, endless time, power that never fades. Dracula has all of that. But he pays for it with isolation, darkness, hunger. He cannot live in sunlight. He cannot age naturally. He cannot truly belong to the world of the living. The psychology behind this is powerful. Dracula turns our greatest desire, eternal life, into a curse. He forces us to question whether living forever would actually be a gift or a prison. Then there's the fear of loss of control. Dracula doesn't just kill his victims, he transforms them. He hypnotizes, he manipulates, he invades the mind he invades the body. That idea strikes something deep inside the human psyche. We fear losing control over ourselves. We fear addiction. We fear manipulation. We fear being influenced without realizing it. Dracula represents all of that. He doesn't break down doors. He whispers. He persuades. He seduces. By the time you realize what's happening, it's already too late. Psychologically, that's far more terrifying than brute force. There's also the fear of the outsider. Dracula travels from Transylvania to England. He studies its culture, learns its language, blends in, but he is never truly one of them. Throughout history, societies have feared the unknown stranger, the one who looks human but carries different customs, beliefs, or intentions. Dracula taps into that ancient instinct. He is both familiar and foreign. Close, yet distant. Safe-looking, yet dangerous. And the human brain is wired to react strongly to that contradiction. Perhaps the deepest psychological layer of all is desire. Dracula isn't just frightening, he's alluring. He represents temptation, the forbidden pull towards something dangerous. His victims often feel drawn to him. There's a strange attraction in the fear. That reflects something uncomfortable about human nature. We are curious about darkness. We are drawn to risk. We sometimes move towards the very things that could harm us. Dracula survives because he lives inside that tension between fear and fascination. Every generation reinterprets him according to its own anxieties. In the Victorian era, he symbolized disease and moral corruption. In the 20th century, he reflected fears of war and hidden enemies. In modern times, he often represents obsession with youth, beauty, and power. The details change, but the psychology remains the same. Dracula is not scary because he drinks blood. He is scary because he exposes what we secretly crave and what we deeply fear. As long as humans struggle with mortality, desire, control, and identity, Dracula will remain relevant. Because he isn't just a creature in a castle, he's a shadow inside the human mind. And shadows, no matter how much light we create, never truly disappear.
Most monsters fade. They scare one generation, then disappear into dusty pages and forgotten reels of film. But Dracula didn't fade. He multiplied. When Bram Stoker published Dracula in 1897, he couldn't have imagined what would happen next. The story should have remained a Victorian Gothic novel, respected, maybe remembered. Instead, it became a living legend. And legends don't die quietly. After early film adaptations like Nosferatu and the iconic 1931 Dracula, the character escaped the boundaries of literature and cinema. He entered global culture. Dracula became shorthand for vampire. Cape, fangs, castle, Transylvanian accent. Even people who never read the book could recognize him instantly. That's when the curse truly began. Because once a character becomes a symbol, it can no longer be killed. Over the decades, Dracula transformed again and again. He appeared in horror films, romantic dramas, comedies, cartoons, novels, comic books, and video games. Sometimes terrifying, sometimes seductive, sometimes even humorous, but always present. In the late 20th century, Bram Stoker's Dracula revived him with operatic intensity. In the 21st century, modern series like Dracula reimagined him for streaming audiences. Each time society changes, Dracula changes with it. He reflects whatever we fear most at that moment. War, disease, foreign threats, loneliness, obsession with eternal youth. The setting evolves, the costume shifts, but the hunger remains the same. That's why the curse refuses to end. Because Dracula isn't tied to one time period. He isn't trapped in the 1800s. He isn't confined to Transylvania. He adapts, just like a virus adapts, just like fear adapts. Every generation thinks it has outgrown old monsters. Technology advances. Science explains the unknown. Superstition fades. And yet, the image of something ancient watching from the darkness still unsettles us. We build brighter cities. We create faster networks. We live in a hyper-connected world. But at night, when the lights go out, the fear remains. That is Dracula's true immortality. Not a body that cannot die, but an idea that cannot disappear. The curse was never about blood. It was about permanence. And as long as humans tell stories in the dark, as long as we whisper about creatures that live forever, Dracula will continue rising from his coffin. Not because he must, but because we keep bringing him back.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell for more. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. See you in the next one. Bye for now.